Hello and welcome to the Indian Classical Guitar Academy. My name is Jack Jennings. As some of you may know or may have guessed by now, one of my favourite guitar players of all time is the legendary John McLaughlin. And there's a famous quote, or at least famous amongst nerdy guitar players, there's a famous quote of John McLaughlin in which he says, "Fingering is everything." And this relates to, on the fretting hand, the choice of fingers and how you arrange the different combinations in order to tackle a phrase. He says that that's the most important thing and that's the key to what he is able to play. Of course, he's known for his legendary right hand technique. His picking technique is incredible, but the kind of different lines that John plays, I mean, he's always had incredible technique in terms of his, well, both hands, but his picking has always been supreme. But the way that his phrases evolve and the way that they weave in and out of the different scales, arpeggios, different fragments and chromatic movements, all of the different things that he puts into his lines, I think that John is probably one of the most varied and intelligent improvisers in terms of the complexity that's built into his lines and the variation of all the different types of motion that there are. Whenever I hear John McLaughlin improvise, I always have a strong sense that I really need to listen and really take account of what he's saying. It's almost like where you've got, you're hearing someone very wise talking and you just feel like I really have to listen very carefully to what this person's saying. That's the feeling that I get when you listen to John improvising. It's interesting that he says that fingering is the most important thing, particularly as an improviser, because you can imagine maybe if you were a classical musician or you were doing everything by reading a score, then of course you're going to work out fingerings and a lot of preparation that goes into performing. Say if you're a violinist and you're playing a violin concerto, or a classical guitar player, you're going to be working on rehearsing the fingerings and working out the best way that you can do it. But as an improviser, fingering is also very, very important, because although you might just be playing different things and you're kind of improvising, making up new things, it's going to be generated out of different patterns and different tendencies and different roots that you've kind of developed throughout your repertoire. And of course you will be playing things that you haven't practiced necessarily, but they're going to be sort of generated by certain principles and that you've been developing, and how intelligent and intuitive your hand is really on the instrument. A lot of it is, you can't really think about what you're playing, but your hand, if it has the right amount of intelligence built into it and it's working with your ear, the hand will find an intelligent way to navigate, and it will make the right sort of decisions in order to not get stuck or not paint yourself into a corner. It will be drawing on a kind of inner knowledge of different combinations and different techniques, and so all of that is kind of programmed into the hand, really. And John's talking about it particularly about as a kind of jazz guitar player, moving across different shapes on the fretboard and playing across different strings, and that's a very, very, very complex way of moving across the instrument. But this saying of fingering being everything, it's very interesting how that actually relates to all different styles of playing and different systems, because my experience of looking at the sitar and taking sitar repertoire and trying to put that directly onto the guitar is that I found that fingering became even more important doing that style. For me personally, it became the definitive reason why I could or could not play something would be based on if I had figured out a good way to finger it and the best way to organize the hand, and that would even start to mentally aid me in terms of breaking things down, breaking a big phrase down into smaller chunks based on the different combinations of fingers that I was using to get through a bigger phrase. So for example, when I first started studying with Roopa Panesar, I remember this amazing sitar player that we're lucky to have in the UK. I remember going to her house and she started playing this exercise where you were constantly extending the scale. So rather than playing the scale just straight up and straight down, you'd start with just the first two notes and then add the third note and then the fourth note and then the fifth note and going up and then taking that over sort of 2 octaves and always retracing your steps back and then just going up again, adding 1 more note. And she was doing it on 1 string on the sitar. So I was trying to play it in the same way to get the same kind of musical effect, to get the same kind of expression and the sort of join between the notes, having that kind of unbroken flow of notes that you get with the sitar that's characteristic of Indian classical music. So I was trying to look at what she was doing, but the technique of fingering on the sitar is one thing and doing it on the guitar is kind of different. Or at least I found that I wanted to approach it in a different way, because although I'd studied the sitar and I kind of knew a way of fingering it in a more pure sitar method, I found that on the guitar, because the scale is, the frets are smaller and the instrument is a smaller scale, it just felt like it was better to try to actually still utilize the kind of like 4-fingeredness that we have as guitar players, rather than with sitar they tend to use 2 fingers and sort of work on basically moving up and down that string using the index finger and then adding the other finger for the top note and coming back. But I found that I could take a lot from the more conventional sort of guitar 4-fingered approach, but try to blend that into more of a sitar method. So when I was first trying to do this exercise, I was just on the edge of my seat, just trying to follow what she was doing, and I was amazed how my hand actually seemed to come up with quite good kind of solutions on the spot. Like, how am I gonna play this? How am I gonna keep in touch here? How am I gonna follow what's coming next? But I felt like my hand was actually doing most of the work, was doing the kind of the mental work for me, in a sense. So that was really interesting. That really made me realize that the only reason why I can keep up with what she's doing is because my hand has actually got a few different solutions that it's kind of just doing on its own without me having to micromanage and think too much. It's kind of guiding itself. But I knew I could take that further. I knew I could get better at that though. So I started to break down these different exercises and then come up with a really strategic method of what would be the best way to apply this to the fretboard, what would be the best way to use that single string to get that lyrical kind of vocal sound of Indian music, but what's the best way to finger it. And it actually became more important, even than regular scales, it became more important to actually have a really solid fingering technique for the 1-string method, because you haven't got a box pattern, you haven't kind of got like a visual, you do have a visual sense of it, but you don't have a box pattern where you can kind of move around that box. You're on that 1 string, and the only way that you can actually break it up and become more fluid with it as a sort of sequence of different sequences of like things that get into a muscle memory is if you actually develop proper fingering strategy and you've developed different sort of habits. So when you're going for a particular part of the scale, you know what kind of fingering is going to work, or at least your hand knows. So your hand will kind of go to the things that are more practical. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to be stuck playing the same things all the time, because the fact is that you're still able to vary what you're doing, but you kind of need to let your hand take over to a certain extent. You need to let your hand, you can't be telling your hand what to do. It's more like your hand needs to automatically know, right, I know how to get out of this situation, I know how to get through these notes, and I've learned a way that's fluid, that feels nice, to get through this different progression. And then you can kind of change what you're doing. You can have a lot of variability, but you need to have a kind of system which is going to enable you just to get things moving. So I'm going to show you an exercise now, which is the same concept that Roopa showed me a few years ago, but it's in a different rag. And this concept is adding 1 more note at a time, gradually going up the structure of the rag, and it's slightly different on the way up and the way down. On the way down it has an extra note, so it's not quite like going up and down a scale, it's got a little bit more detail to it. But the only reason I'm able to play this, what you're seeing, is because I've worked on a specific fingering method, and that's the only reason why I can do this. So just have a little look at this, and then I'll talk to you more about how you can also learn how to do this. Okay, so that's part of this new course that's in Rageshree, and it's using a 7-beat cycle, and you might have noticed, it's called Roopa cycle, played on the tabla. And there's a lesson as part of this course where I really break down the fingerings, and I also talk about why I'm using them and why it works for this particular part of the scale. And it basically helps to break everything down into sort of bite-sized chunks, and this kind of chunking method of where you break things down actually is really the key to a lot of fast playing. So it becomes more like a collection of bigger units rather than, you know, a million different notes that you have to think about playing. It becomes more like a structure of different units that are all linked together, and that simplifies your thinking and gets it into the muscle memory in a much more effective way. So moving on from that, I've got another exercise here where I take this sort of concept of these types of phrases, and then I've joined them up with a composition that's in 7-beat cycle. And this composition was taught to me by Shakir, who's another sitar player that I've studied with. And I'm also taking a few different ideas of the kind of things that he would teach me about constructing different lines and T-high rhythms. And I've just put this into a kind of like mini performance in a sense. It's still really an exercise because each fast run is played 2 times round, so you can kind of get a sense of what's actually happening. And this is all part of the guitar course. If you sign up to the academy, you'll access this and you'll get slower speeds to practice with. The tablet shows on the screen, but you'll be able to practice along a bit nice and slow and have a guided lesson where I teach you all the different fingerings. So just enjoy this bit of music here. It's a good example of the kind of technique and how this thing has resulted in something a bit like a performance. So you can just kind of enjoy this, but just know that this is the kind of thing that I'm working on with my students, breaking these things down. This is one of the more advanced things, but it's nice to see what you can do with it when it becomes more fluid and more natural. So thanks for sticking around, and I'll see you on another video soon. want to start one of these courses, you can buy them individually or you can subscribe monthly to access all of them. For subscribers, there will be new content every month, including live streams where we can answer your personal questions and go into more detail about applying this material. So far we've covered Raag Yaman, Raag Rageshree, Jog, Hamsadwani, Kafi and Raag McLaughlin's, and there's much more to come. This body of work is a culmination of the 18 years experience I have as a guitar teacher, combined with the knowledge acquired through studying the sitar directly, and then adapting that material using the guitar techniques that suit this style best. To create these courses and gather the most authentic material possible, I work closely with other Indian classical musicians such as Manish Pingle and Gurdeng Riot. I'd like to give a special thanks to my guru Roopa Panesar, who has guided me in the creation of these courses. Much of the material has been adapted directly from my training with her. Also Shakir Khan, my guru, who's been inspiring me immensely and continues to shape how I approach the instrument and this incredible world of Indian classical music.